This lesson covers creating a new domain controller. So before you start, you need to make sure the server has a static IP address. And if it's going to be an additional domain controller in an existing domain, ideally you would already have made this server a member of that domain. So to install, in prior versions to Windows 2012, you would run dcpromo. This was a separate utility, a separate wizard that promoted a server from a member server or standalone server, i.e. not a member of a domain, to a domain controller. This process is now actually part of Server Manager, and that same dcpromo process can be used to take a domain controller and make it a member server. So you can switch between member server and domain controller at any time. So I'm going to Manage, Add Roles and Features. It's a role-based. I'm going to select my local server, but I could do this remotely. I'm going to add Active Directory, and it's going to add those management tools automatically. Again, I could do this through PowerShell. I don't need any other features. And all this is going to say is, remember the DNS server needs to be installed. If you do not have it, you're going to be prompted to install it as part of this installation. So remember how critical DNS is to Active Directory. It's that locator service. So when I create Active Directory, if there isn't the right DNS service available, and really remember this has to support dynamic update and those resource, those service records, I'm going to have to create a DNS service to support that. And it's very common to run DNS on your Active Directory domain controllers. I'm going to say restart if required and install. Once the reboot has completed, Server Manager will complete the rest of the installation, and it's going to tell you that now configuration is required. And it's actually related to these Active Directory domain services, i.e. the actual dcpromo process. Now, I should point out, if I go to a command prompt, dcpromo is actually still there. And the reason this is still here is really so, let's say you had an answer file. So prior to Windows Server 2012, when you ran the dcpromo process, it was actually possible to create an unattended answer file that you could use on future domain controllers. This is the format that was previously used. You can see it's really just a text file with a list of parameters to answer the configuration. This has been replaced in 2012 with PowerShell. But the idea is, let's say you still had these configuration files you like to use, well, I could still use it with 2012 by passing it to this dcpromo process, but it's absolutely not the preferred method. The preferred method is now to use PowerShell, but it is there if you needed it. So now I can click on the arrow and say promote this server to a domain controller. So I now have the choice of add a domain controller to an existing domain, add a new domain to an existing forest, so I would pass it the domain who will be the parent, or add a whole new forest. So in this example, I'm going to say add a new forest. I'm just going to call it savtest.local. It's going to go and check, and it's basically going to find there's no servers that can host this. So it's going to say I have to add DNS, and because it's the first domain controller in a new domain, I'm going to make it a global catalog. Also, because it's the first domain controller in a new domain, it cannot be a read-only domain controller. So a read-only domain controller is a special type of domain controller that has a read-only copy of the Active Directory database and only some of the passwords for certain accounts. The goal is I would use a read-only domain controller at a branch office. If I cannot physically secure that server as well as a typical data center, I can make it a read-only domain controller. I can then tell it which users are at that location. It would only cache the passwords for those particular users. Additionally, because it's read-only, if some hacker, for example, does infiltrate that domain controller, if they make any changes, then they won't replicate back up to the rest of the Active Directory. They would be ignored, so it limits the exposure of that domain controller. I type a directory services restore mode. So this is if I had to reboot this server to restore objects. It's a special mode. What account would I use to authenticate? Now, if this was a new domain controller in an existing tree or forest, I can do DNS delegations. This would tell the parent DNS server this new zone, this new domain name is hosted by these set of DNS servers. But I can't do that because there's no authoritative parent zone available. You also have a legacy NetBIOS domain name. So remember, in Active Directory, our domain names are DNS names. They have to be valid. But some applications will still use the NetBIOS domain name. This is a 15-character name, 15 usable characters. There is a 16th character that's reserved, which is another name for this domain, for those legacy applications. and by default it will be the leftmost part of the DNS name, but I can change it. I can set the paths for where it's going to store those sysvol, where it's going to store my database, my log files, and I can review it. Now at this point, if I do view script, it's actually going to now show me the PowerShell. So notice this is very different from that unattended answer file I had in the past. Now it's just giving me a single PowerShell command that I can use. So instead of having to pass some unattended answer file, I just run this PowerShell command. Now this is because it's creating a new forest. Likewise, if I was just adding a replica domain controller, it would give me a different command. So I'm going to cancel that, but that's the process you would actually use to create a new domain, a new tree, a new forest in your environment. And indeed, it's the same process you would use to add a new domain controller to an existing domain. You would just change those options. One additional option you would have, if I was actually creating a new domain controller in an existing domain, it will give me the option of where I wish to replicate that domain from initially. So one of the things I can do is something called install from media. I can actually create a special set of data on an existing domain controller. So rather than having to perform that initial replication of all the content of the domain over the network, I can actually just create this install from media content, ship it to the location I'm creating that domain controller, and create the DC from that material. So it's actually fairly simple to create. I use that same NTDS util I used to show the partitions earlier. I'm going to go back to my root NTDS util. I'm going to say install from media. And I'm just going to say create sysvol full and then a path. So for example, install from media. It's going to create a snapshot of that content and then populate into that IFM folder, which it's going to create a copy of the Active Directory database. I would then back this up, put it on a tape, a USB drive, ship it to the location, and when I run that DC process, I would specify this as the location to initially populate the Active Directory. Now there will still be changes from when I created this and the current state of the Active Directory, but it would obviously cut down a lot of the initial data. So it would populate the AD from this content and then do a synchronization with the AD to capture any objects that have changed since this media was created. This concludes the lesson on creating a domain controller.